The 2004 U.S. presidential election would see incumbent President George W. Bush narrowly defeat Democrat challenger John Kerry with 286 electoral votes and just over 50% of the popular vote, compared to Kerry's 251 electoral votes and 48% of the popular vote. The Democrat primaries in our timeline saw John 3 Purple Heart Kerry defeat Howard Dean, Joe Lieberman, John Edwards, and Wesley Clark, who is the subject of today's video. Originally, he was seen as an anti-war general. Clark stumbled in the first few days of his candidacy, as he was perceived as changing his answer on how he would have voted on the Iraq War resolution. His supporters argued that his perceived indecision was due to lack of experience with the media and their insistence on short soundbite answers. Wesley Clark had begun to get politically active following his retirement from the military in 2000, where he found the idea that the Bush administration would not intervene in the Kosovo War to have been unsettling. Several polls from September to November of 2003 actually showed Clark leading the Democrat field of candidates, or as a close second to Howard Dean. Since Dean had consistently pulled in the lead in the Iowa caucus, Clark would opt out of participating entirely and focus on later primaries instead. However, this caucus would see Clark miss a massive opportunity, as the frontrunners being Dean and Dick Gephardt would garner results far lower than expected, and John Kerry would start taking the lead. Although Clark performed reasonably well in later primaries, such as in a tie for third place with Edwards in the New Hampshire primary and winning the Oklahoma primary, he saw his third place finish in Tennessee and distant third in Virginia as signs that he had lost the South, which his campaign had been centered on. He withdrew from the race on February 11, 2004, and announced his endorsement for John Kerry on February 13th. Clark believed that him opting out of the Iowa caucus was one of his campaign's biggest mistakes. Changes to make in an alternate timeline would have to see Clark participate in the Iowa caucus, as it was the beginning of Kerry's rise and Dean's downfall. As Clark always performed pretty well in primaries, if he participated in Iowa, I have no doubt that he could easily make massive gains early on against many Democrat challengers, and may potentially halt Kerry's gains in Iowa as well. Unlike most Democrat candidates, Clark could appeal to conservative Democrats while also being against Bush's administration's handling of the Iraq War, which was a key demographic that Kerry really couldn't appeal to. For his presidential running mate, yeah, I do think Clark would have to pick John Kerry, who in this timeline would have dropped out early on. Clark would have needed to pick someone to appeal to the liberal wing of the party, but also somewhat moderate in order to actually win the 2004 election, while not splitting the Democrat Party between some angry third-party protest voters who didn't think Clark was liberal enough. Clark versus Bush in the general election would see the pair spar over many issues in the presidential debates, with Clark barely edging out Bush in this alternate timeline. Additionally, Kerry would definitely do better in debating against Dick Cheney than Edwards did in our timelines, because Edwards absolutely flopped. But let's say Clark ends up narrowly defeating Bush. With that, what's his time in office going to be like? Clark's presidential platform had called for a repeal of recent Bush tax cuts for people earning more than $200,000 and suggested providing health care for the uninsured by altering the existing system rather than transforming to a completely new universal health care. He also backed environmental causes, such as promising to reverse scaled-down rules that the Bush administration had applied to the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, and dealing with global warming by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Domestically, I'm not sure how much of this he could actually get done. You see, on the one hand, Republicans controlled the Senate and House, so before 2006 it would be very difficult for President Clark to get some of the much more liberal policies passed. And then the other issues that Clark would face would of course be Hurricane Katrina, and the housing market is still going to crash, and the Great Recession will make things be pretty bad. I personally don't see Democrats gaining too much in 2006, with the domestic situation looking pretty bad, so like I said, it's hard to say how much of his platform he could actually get accomplished on the domestic front. Now on to more interesting things, foreign policy. Now in our timeline, the Bush administration supported the color revolutions in former Soviet states to spread democracy through nonviolent means, and in some countries it was largely successful, while other countries would see little to no concessions. Now with Clark instead of Bush at the helm, things would probably go relatively similar, but instead with more potential NATO intervention. Remember, Clark only began to get political after the Bush administration in 2000 had not wanted to do things like the Kosovo intervention of 1999. As for the war in Afghanistan, I honestly don't think too much changes from 2004 to 2008 under Clark's term in office. By 2005, the Taliban resurgence was in full force, and from 2006 to 2007, the war was escalating. Now, I don't believe Clark's administration would have done too much differently than Bush on Afghanistan at this time, other than probably deploying more troops and increasing NATO involvement, as Clark had been previously Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and now onto something that would definitely be very different: the war in Iraq. Regarding Iraq, beginning in 2005, the insurgent forces coalesced around several main factions, including the Islamic Army in Iraq and Ansar al-Sunnah, and violence was escalating between many different insurgent groups, as well as non-Iraqi terror groups in the country. Now, the Iraqi Civil War started in 2006 and would still happen like in our timeline. However, Clark's response may definitely not be the same as Bush's. In our timeline, President Bush enacted the troop surge in 2007 as a response to the continuing deteriorating situation in Iraq as the civil war got worse and worse, and of course the ethnic cleansing between Shia and Sunni groups and sectarian violence in the civil war got a lot nastier. Bush didn't have to worry about re-election or public perception, as by 2007 the war was extremely unpopular. Anyway, the surge would work and stabilize the country by 2008. However, in this alternate timeline, following the 2006 midterms, Clark is definitely gonna have the 2008 election to think about. Now, of course, it's definitely in everyone's best interest to enact the troop surge, as Donald Rumsfeld's light military footprint had been an absolute failure throughout the insurgency. Also, Clark kinda wanted to almost start World War III in the Pristina airport during the Kosovo War, so it's hard to say what Clark would want to do regarding troop numbers in Iraq during his term. Proponents and opponents of the surge in our timeline were predominantly on party lines, with the exception of Ron Paul, who strongly opposed the surge, and Joe Lieberman, who strongly supported it. In this alternate timelines, things may be in the reverse, where Republicans oppose the surge aside from John McCain and Lindsey Graham, while Democrats would support the troop surge. And of course, with Democrats likely taking a further hit on Congress and Senate seats in the 2006 midterms due to the war, things are going to be more difficult for Clark. Then there's the 2008 election. Like I said, in our timeline, President Bush didn't have to worry about running for re-election because he was on the tail end of his second term and was essentially a lame duck president for his final 2 years in office with a hostile Senate and Congress. So he enacted the surge despite its unpopularity. Meanwhile, in this timeline, Clark is going to have re-election to worry about and a hostile Congress and Senate. He should do the surge. However, if he doesn't due to public perception, then Iraq is going to go even deeper into the crapper in 2007 and collapses in 2008. However, it's unknown whether or not he will do the surge, and how he would be able to propose it to Congress and the Senate. Speaking of 2008, the Georgia War is going to kick off, which brings me to what Russian revisionism is going to look like in this alternate timeline. Now, like I said before, Clark wanted to attack the Russians at the Pristina airport during the 1999 Kosovo War. So with that, despite how much Republicans would likely complain about Clark's handling of the war on terror, nobody would doubt how tough Clark would be on Russia during his administration and challenging revisionism, and things between the US and Russia are going to be rather hostile, but Clark would make it very clear that Russia can't be expanding its influence. The 2008 Republican nomination and primaries would likely see John McCain run on a hawkish war on terror platform, especially on Iraq. Meanwhile, Ron Paul runs on an isolationist platform, criticizing Clark's handling of the war on terror and wanting to focus on the economy following the housing market's crash in the Great Recession. It's also possible that George W. Bush comes back for re-election, as conservatives saw him as the new Reagan, and he barely lost re-election in 2004 when he was a considerably popular president, especially since things aren't looking too great for Clark's administration. However, if George Bush didn't try to run for re-election, it's pretty likely that his brother Jeb is going to come into the picture. As for the 2008 general election, incumbent President Wesley Clark is likely going to lose re-election to the Republican challenger. This will now see the new Republican administration run things from 2008 to 2012 and face the issues of Russian revisionism and expansion following Clark's stances, as well as dealing with an unknown situation in Iraq, depending entirely on whether or not Clark enacted the surge. Additionally, Barack Obama isn't president in 2008, and a Republican will be president at the time where the U.S. is trying to get out of the Great Recession, so Obama's future career is unknown. However, I think he would make a shot at the 2012 Democrat nomination. That's just one possible scenario. What do you think would have happened if Wesley Clark won the 2004 election? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.